Psalm 46 was a favourite psalm of Martin Luther's. During the Reformation, during his battles with Romanism, he would often be heard saying to his friend Philip Melanchthon, his assistant as well, "Come, Philip, and let's sing the 46th Psalm together." Psalm 46 was one of those psalms that sustained Martin Luther through all of his challenges and battles and trials during the Reformation. And this was especially the case in 1527. In 1527 was really the most difficult year of Martin Luther's life. At the start of that year, he contracted numerous illnesses. He had stomach complaints, he had complaints with his intestines and heart complaints as well. And at one stage during that year, he actually felt that he was going to pass away. He even questioned whether the Lord still had a work for him to do because he was so ill. Towards the end of that year, then the Black Plague, it broke out in Europe and it spread to Wittenberg, where Martin Luther ministered for the Lord. Many people, they left Wittenberg, but Martin Luther and his wife Katie and their son Hans, they felt that it was God's will for them to stay and care for the sick and care for the dying in Wittenberg during that time through the Black Plague. And Psalm 46 then became a tremendous source of strength and encouragement for Martin Luther. As he emerged through the pain of losing loved ones, the pain of caring for the sick during that time of the Black Plague, and thinking about the words of Psalm 46 verse 1, where we read, "God is a refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." Martin Luther then wrote the words of the famous Reformation hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing." It was this thought of God being a refuge, of God being a source of strength, how he kept Martin Luther through all that he faced in the Black Plague, that inspired Martin Luther to write that God was a mighty fortress and a bulwark never failing. Of course, you can see the parallel. Whilst our pandemic may not be as bad as what was faced 500 years ago in the Black Plague, nonetheless, we do face a very real pandemic with a great loss of life. And many are impacted by COVID-19. And so we come today to Psalm 46, and I really just want to draw some lessons from this psalm. The thought of being safeguarded by the Lord. And Psalm 46 is very interesting because Psalm 46, I believe, was actually a lockdown psalm. It was written as King Hezekiah emerged from a period of lockdown. See, the backdrop to Psalm 46 really is found in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 19. This psalm was not written by King David. No, it was written by King Hezekiah, who ministered much later, was the king much later than King David. In 2 Kings 18 and 19, you read of the people of God essentially being locked down in the city of Jerusalem. The king of Assyria, Sennacherib at that time, he decided he would try and take over Jerusalem, and so he encamped outside the city in an attempt really to starve the people out and force them to surrender. But in 2 Kings 18 and 19, you read of King Hezekiah. He enters into the temple. He's received a letter from Sennacherib threatening him really with this impending invasion. And you read of him taking that letter and spreading it before the Lord in prayer and asking God to intervene. What was the result? Well, the Lord sent an angel, and this angel then dealt with the 125,000 strong army that was encamped outside the city of Jerusalem. And think about God's intervention, how he sustained his people as they were isolated in the city of Jerusalem, as God protected his people, as he was with his people. King Hezekiah then takes up his pen under the inspiration of God, and he writes Psalm 46, the contents of Psalm 46. And I just want to draw on what King Hezekiah wrote, what God wrote through the pen of King Hezekiah, and the lessons that he deduced and he learned from how the Lord sustained his people in lockdown and isolation during that time, that period where Sennacherib was outside, and how they were hemmed in the city of Jerusalem. Of course, we're hemmed in today, aren't we? And we need to be reminded of these timely truths, how the Lord is with us during such a time. I just want to take a bird's eye view quickly of Psalm 46 and draw a few thoughts from it. I trust will encourage your heart today. The first thing I think we see in Psalm 46, when we think about being safeguarded by the Lord in isolation, that's really what happened. The people of God were safeguarded by him. They were protected by him. I think we see that in verse 1. It's God's protection. God's protection. Hezekiah, looking at what the Lord had done, he stated, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. The name God here is Elohim. It's not Jehovah, and it's not one of the Jehovah titles we've been looking at in our other videos. It's Elohim. And it's the first name of God that you actually encounter in the Bible. Genesis 1 verse 1, we read, in the beginning, God created. And it's the same name here. It was in the beginning, Elohim created. And this name, it refers to God being the strong and mighty one. So here's Hezekiah. And as he sees the enemy outside, encamping outside Jerusalem, who does he look toward? He looks toward the strong and mighty one. And he calls this strong and mighty one a refuge. The term refuge in the Hebrew, it refers to many different things. It really has the idea of somewhere quiet that you can go to and find a shelter. Sometimes it was used of a tower where you could hide away. Sometimes it was used of a room, a quiet room. And here's Hezekiah. It was it probably would have been in a room in the house of God, or a room in one of the chambers in the palace where he was, a quiet place. And as he was there, he looked around and he stated, God is our refuge. He is that, really that place that I can go to, that place that I know I'll find shelter and security for my soul. Child of God, you see the parallel here, don't you? Such a time when we're isolated, when we feel ourselves to be hemmed in. The term trouble in verse 1, in the Hebrew, it has the idea of walls. They're closing in. And we very much feel like that at this time during isolation, especially this week when the weather hasn't been great and we've been stuck inside. It's been raining. And we feel at times like the walls are closing in on us. We don't know what to do. Let's not forget that God, the strong and mighty one, Elohim, he is our refuge and our strength in time of trouble. In verse 2, Hezekiah, he states, though the earth be removed and the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. The term earth here is land. And the term removed here in the Hebrew, it has the idea of changing hands. And really, verse 2, Hezekiah, what's he saying? He's saying, though the land change hands. Though the land change hands. And let's not forget, there was a very real possibility of change occurring whenever he wrote this psalm. The enemy, an enemy nation, the Assyrians, they were encamped outside, and they had one intent: to take that land, to take that locality, Jerusalem, from under Hezekiah's nose. And Hezekiah recognizes that even though the land, the earth, it might change hands, though things are changing all the time, that's really what he's saying. Though things are changing all the time, God is our refuge and strength. Child of God, again, I think the application is very, very pertinent and straight, isn't it? Things are changing all the time. With COVID-19, we hear that the updates, we worry when we'll be let out and let loose, when lockdown will finish, completely finish. Will it completely finish? Things change for us on a daily and a weekly basis. Things change with our loved ones. Things change in our own personal circumstances. And yet, though change is happening all the time, God, he is protecting us. He is with you. He is your refuge and your strength in time of trouble. So Hezekiah, as he thinks about the Lord safeguarding his people in isolation, at this time, whenever they were hemmed in, whenever the walls were closing in, as it were, he thought about God's protection, or he writes about God's protection. The The second thing then he speaks of here is of God's presence. God's presence. In verse 4, we read, "There is a river, the streams whereof make glad the city of God." As a young Christian reading Psalm 46, I struggled for a long time with this verse. Why on earth, after speaking of God being our refuge and strength, about God protecting his people, does God then in verse 4 speak of a river? What's this all about? Well, history would tell us that during this time of isolation and lockdown for Hezekiah, he was able to channel in or conduit in water from the spring of Gihon off the Kidron Valley just outside Jerusalem. He was able to channel in that water or conduit that water secretly without Sennacherib knowing. You imagine that the people of God, they're hemmed in, they have no way of getting out, no way of getting in. This would have affected supplies. There was no way really for fresh water or for fresh food. Of course, water is a basic necessity to keep us alive. So you imagine the people of God, they're hemmed in, they're kept in, they don't know what's happening, and then all of a sudden this fresh spring is channeled into the midst of the city. How encouraging that would have been, how revitalizing that would have been, how refreshing this spring was for the people of God. It actually sustained them and kept them alive. During this time of lockdown or isolation, when they were hemmed in the city of Jerusalem. Then in verse 5, Hezekiah states, God is in the midst of her and she shall not be moved, and God shall help her in that right early. God's in the midst of her. In verse 4, what this spring was physically for the people of God, I believe there's an allusion here to what the Spirit of God is spiritually for his people. This water was a constant supply for the people of God. It refreshed them, it revitalized them, it kept them alive. Child of God, what is it that's going to sustain you, refresh you, revitalize you during this time of trouble, during this time of being hemmed in or feeling hemmed in? It's the thought in verse 5, God's in the midst of her and she shall not be moved. It's just God's presence with you. The Bible tells us that we are to be constantly filled with the Spirit of God. Ephesians 5:18, "Be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit of God." Constantly filled with the Spirit. Psalm 92 verse 10, "I shall be anointed with fresh oil." There's David. He recognizes the fresh need of the oil of the Spirit of God every day upon his life. So again, child of God, what is it that's going to help you, sustain you during this time of isolation? Like the people of God in Psalm 46. It's the water of the Spirit of God. It's that fresh spring of the Spirit of God being funneled and flowed to your heart. How does this happen? Simply prayer. The Gospels tell us that when we ask for the Spirit, God will not give us that which we don't ask for. When we ask for the Spirit of God, He gives the Spirit. He gives the Spirit of God. So, child of God, what is it that's going to sustain, strengthen, even help you survive lockdown spiritually? It's the water of the Spirit of God. In 2 Corinthians 4 verse 16 we read, "Though our outward man perish, yet our inner man is renewed day by day." It's the renewing of the inner man day by day. So God's protection and God's presence. Lastly, I think we see here God's power. In verse 8, Hezekiah, he states, "Come behold the works of the Lord." Really what he's doing here is he's saying, look what the Lord has done. Look at how God has dealt with this 125,000 strong army. How this angel has been sent and miraculously intervened. How the Lord has shown his power and ended this lockdown. He gets more specific in verse 9. How he maketh wars to cease. How he breaketh the bow, cutteth the spears in sunder. This angel obviously, he destroyed the implements, the war implements of the Assyrian army. And what he's really saying is, look, the Lord's done this. The Lord has intervened. The Lord has ceased this time of isolation and lockdown. He's dealt with the enemy. Child of God, as we're locked down, as we're hemmed in, as we're in a time of trouble, let's just simply pray and invoke the Almighty, strong and powerful one, God. Let's invoke him and say, Lord, just as you intervened in Psalm 46, show your power. Let's not forget that God could deal with coronavirus in a moment, in an instant, in the blink of an eye. He could just remove it. He has the power, the capacity, the capability to do so. So let's pray to that end, that God would accomplish his purpose for this world generally and for us specifically, for his church through COVID-19, but at the same time, that he would accomplish his purposes speedily, that he would show himself strong, and that he would, in all of this, that he would safeguard his people through this time of isolation. So I trust that as we thought about being safeguarded through isolation, that you're encouraged as we thought of Psalm 46.